Basically MTG. I'm your host, Bad Kitty, and today I'll be joined by Reptile and Synergistic to talk about, well, basically MTG. Don't forget to follow us on our socials to keep up with what we're posting and playing. All of those links are in the description down below. In today's episode, we are covering one of the most confusing topics in Magic the Gathering, power levels in EDH. What are power levels in EDH, Reptile?
So power levels are usually scaled on or put on a scale of 1 through 10. So with 1 generally being just a random pile of cards, and the top decks are the 10, and usually the 9 being the cedh decks. So the decks we talked about earlier, the top of the meta, and the middle is pretty subjective. We're going to be using a guide to power levels, which will be shown on screen. Just quick glimpse, and we're going to be just discussing kind of what they're saying in the middle. So we'll start at the very bottom.
This
Random
specific,
pile of
right, this specific guide is very commonly shared in a lot of EDH circles. So that's why we chose this guide. This is not just like a random guide that we grabbed off the internet. This is something that, like, being in the EDH circles, we've seen come up a lot and referenced a lot. And we wanted to sit down specifically and break this down because the way this is broken down, some of us don't fully agree with and don't understand. So it's good to sit down and, like, fully from the bottom to the top discuss what each thing means, and if it's even necessary to have a definition of, like, being a power level in EDH. So like you were just saying, Reptile, we should start with just a random pile of cards.
Yeah, have you ever seen Synergistic? Have you ever seen anyone pull up with just a random pile of cards? I feel like that one's pretty useless because I've never seen anyone just show up with lands and
I don't even know what that really means. Like a random pile of cards. Like none of the cards you can you even cast any of the cards?
Yeah, I feel like it's just a placeholder of, like, okay, if your deck is really, really bad. I feel like 1, 2, and 3 honestly are like that. Because most precons are around a 4, and I don't think I've ever seen anything worse than a precon unless people intentionally try to do that, but that's a real 0 thing. So
yeah, I guess, like, if, an example could be like someone's playing like mono white angels, and even then, like, I don't know if, like, they have no card draw, right? They have no removal. It's literally lands and angels, planes and angels.
But it's still structured.
Sure.
I mean, even at that though, it would fall under a level 2 because it has a strategy, like Reptile just said. Whereas a level 1, like, it doesn't even have a theme. There's, like, you can't even say, like, oh, this is an elf deck or this is an angel deck, because that makes it automatically a level 2. So, like, you see what I'm saying?
According to this chart that we showed, level 6 decks with a plan. So they have a definite strategy in mind, or multiple that synergize well, something like angels. So they're putting 5s at upgraded precons. They're putting 3s at normal precons. So what do you guys think about normal precons? I know this deck is little. I think this list is from 2020, and the precons have definitely gotten better since then. So given the take on it, what do you guys think are generally the precons, so that way we have a good base where everyone's at?
Yeah, so I think the person that made this, they were well intended, and I think, not to, like, put down somebody's work or whatever. I think this is, a good way to start the conversation. However, I think this whole list needs to be thrown out, and, like, I think we need to talk about it in terms of efficiency, and how efficient and the strategy is, or how efficient the deck is. That can be in terms of lands, in terms of, like, fetches, tutors, etc., etc. So in my perfect world, or my perfect view, it would be, like, in terms of, like, 25% efficiency, 50% efficiency, 75% efficient, and 100% efficient. With good strategy. So obviously you can have a deck that's 100% efficient and have a crappy strategy, so it's never going to win, right? So it's like a balancing act. So in that perfect world, I would put, like, a precon, like, at 25%, right? There's a bunch of tap lands, there's no tutors, there's barely any fetches. Some of the creatures are big clunky creatures, but they do synergize well together, right? And that's when you can, like,
they have a
efficiency.
focus.
Yeah, so that's where I would put it. Using this list, I mean, I guess a strong precon versus a normal precon. I could not tell you what the real difference is. I'm sure.
So I do have a specific example of, like, what a quote unquote strong precon would be compared to, like, normal precons. Strong precons are super rare in terms of, like, releasing certain cards and stuff from Magic, especially because they're precons. And so, like a specific example for me would be the Jeskai deck from the Ikoria Commander set, right? That came with a free counterspell. That gives you an advantage over every other, especially in that like 5 set. Each had their own free spell, but that was a free non-creature counterspell. That card is still going for like $30 to $40 on the market today. That gives it an automatic, like a singular card automatic advantage, as well as it being very like efficient and tuned and having a good game plan. And so that to me would be a strong precon of like precons that include very strong cards. Because there's another Jeskai precon that's a little bit older, but it has a Dockside Extortionist in it. That automatically sets it above like a starter deck from like one of the new 5 starter decks that were just released, because like they're not reprinting anything that's that valuable right now.
So do you
And
think some precons really break the mold, and they kind of just have some sleeper cards in them that automatically make them higher in power level?
Absolutely, because if you were to take those precons and just upgrade them, those cards would be auto includes. Like a Dockside Extortionist, if you run red, like unless you're anti-artifacts, you want it in there, right?
Yeah, and even if you are, a lot of the times you just get it underneath, and it's shown over time how valuable it's been in the meta, and I don't think that's really going to change. But
Right.
it brings up another question of where can one card at what point does your deck change in power level? Because we were just talking about Dockside Extortionist single-handedly doing that, and I think you were mentioning Fierce Guardianship, right? As the free counterspell.
Yes. Fierce Guardianship
Yes.
would be the free counterspell. For me personally, I feel like the power level increases the faster you can start your game plan. So at a 25%, we'll use the percentages. At a 25% power level, you're really not starting your game plan until like turn 4 or 5. And that's just starting. That's not even like completing it or winning. That's just getting it rolling, because most precons there, like Synergistic said, they're tap lands, there's no tutors. You are going in totally raw, top decking. So like you need draw outlets and things like that. And in a precon, like but they're slower on purpose to make it a softer deck.
I think that's a good interpretation of it. I think another thing you can also include is another thing that Synergistic said, like tutors, fetches. All those make your deck a lot more consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the reason why people go to Commander is for the inherent, it's a 100 card singleton, so it's meant to be a little bit more random, and it gives the format an identity in a sense of like a high replayability, because there's a singleton format, and you're not going to see the same strategy and the same wins each time. But the more you upgrade the power level, more often than not, the strategies are going to be really consistent, and your deck is going to perform and win the same way nearly every single time. So I think that's another thing to consider, is alongside the efficiency, is just how often are you really just doing the same lines, same play strategies, same interactions. So what about you, Synergistic? And you mentioned all those tutors. At what point does it start to creep into that realm where you're really getting competitive?
Yeah, I think once you start adding fetches, once you start adding a couple tutors, once you have a very well defined strategy that's very efficient, like you say. So it's, instead of using, like, for example, a 4-card combo, it is now a 3 or 2-card combo that win you the game. Or I think even 4 is like a little on the low side. I think some precons can have like a six or so card combo that win, right? Or very cards that work very well together. But if you're playing competitive, you can be playing Thassios, and Demonic Consultation or Tainted Pact, right? And that's wins, right? Those 2 cards together will win the game. So that's kind of what I think. Going back to what Bad Kitty was saying about some precons, having this one extra card will make them from a strong precon to a normal precon. I understand the free counter and potentially the dark side being, in comparison to the same decks being very strong, but I don't think one card generally makes a deck stronger than the other, because you can have a bunch of duels in a dinosaur deck and that's not going to do anything, and duels are very efficient cards. I think it really matters on what your strategy is doing. So for example, when we were talking about the Dockside deck or the free Jeskai deck, I'm not very familiar with those decks, so I really can't speak to them. But I would wager that the decks are probably very inefficient regardless. Even if you have Dockside, they're not going to be very good, period. So
Right.
I don't always like find that comparison to be like, it doesn't really
Well,
mean anything to me.
That comparison was strictly comparing precons to precons.
Yeah.
Now, if we're talking homebrews to precons, a singular card is not going to make a precon better than a homebrew. Also, with like upgrades, a singular card is not going to change your upgrade from a 4 on the list to like a 7. It's going to make it more efficient, and I think that maybe you'll win a turn sooner or just make things cleaner. But like when it is a constructed, you bought these 100 cards and sit down to play with them, I feel like that, like having a Dockside in there where other precons have like 2-3 cost artifacts to get down, and I think it's just incredibly strong.
Yeah, no, I get that. I 100% get that. And the thing about like the system I was saying, which is like from 1 to 100 percentage wise, conveniently it is a 100 card format. So changing one card makes it from 25 to 26 if you want to be like Q with it,
Right,
whatever. Obviously, like Reptile said, like your deck needs to be efficient or it needs to be very well focused, right? You can have 100 really good cards in your deck and not have a goal, and you're never gonna win. So where does that fall on the scale? I don't know. It's a hard thing, and again, kudos to this person for putting this together. It's a hard conversation to have indeed. I know Reptile, we've played Spell Table before, and we've gone in. We put like little like 5 to 6 power level, right? And people are playing tutors, they're playing like Mana Crib, they're playing fast mana. They have Demonic, Consultation, and Thassa's Oracle. Obviously, those are anecdotes, but I've definitely seen that enough times where we can be like playing 7 and 8s, 5 and 6, and people are just comboing off. You're going to town with us.
Yeah, and I've noticed in those they're not going for the exact same things that they're doing. It almost kind of goes down to like, I agree with what you said of how Dockside, and we're going back on Dockside, but Dockside, Mana Crypt, Demonic Tutor, all those things that we see, they don't necessarily win on their own. I guess it's more of what you're doing with them, because in that Jeskai deck, you could probably just Dockside to play one of those big blue creatures, and you could have just waited, but it accelerates you a little bit forward, and it's not a game ender. Or you're Mana Crypting into your commander, which is say it's a pretty weak commander overall. The Mana Crypt, I feel like a lot of those cards that are super efficient can actually be used to help out lesser strategies that and allow them to compete. So I think it does also just come down to what you're intending to do with your deck. And,
right.
I mean, tempo is definitely part of the game. So Mana Crypts, Dockside, accelerating yourself past that. If everyone's equal, then you're definitely getting an advantage, and it makes a difference then. But yeah.
Right. I think that's a good point to kind of like, you had just mentioned something to kind of run down, was the different strategies and how they have different power levels within themselves. So like, say a aristocrat strategy, you're not necessarily winning turn 1, turn 2, whereas like, big mana, you're getting big creatures out there to threaten life totals, and depending on where the pod's power level is sitting and if there's interaction and things like that, it can really pressure a game. And so like when you guys talk about strength and things like that, are there specific strategies in which like there's a definitive list outside of this tier list of strategies that have their own tiers in terms of their strength?
I think overall they would, with tiers of like different strategies. Like I even see on EDH Rec, I know what you mean, of like there's an aristocrat strategy and then there's big mana, and they kind of have it structured out, and you could even maybe take the data from EDH Rec, and whichever strategy is the most played might be the strongest or the most popular, most powerful based on consensus. But yeah, I think each strategy eventually comes down to winning the game, and it's because winning the game or ending the game essentially takes everything away. And I think that, like we said, we're discussing the power levels, but the power levels are intrinsically brought up from mostly Rule Zero conversations. So when you're having this conversation, it's also kind of tied into what kind of game experience do you want, and how do you want to play? Because if you end the game, there's no other thing that can happen outside of that, and then you have to restart, and then that could keep happening, and no one ever gets to play their own strategy, and that's when you start to run into problems. So I think the power level, each strategy, I wouldn't condemn a strategy or any kind of strategy if it was meeting the same power level. I would say, like, if you're for some reason a stacks deck at like a 5, but you're playing some really big over the top stacks things, say like Overwhelming Splendor, that's like 8 mana or something like that, then I can see it being like, okay, you want to play that strategy, but you also want to play at the same pace that we want to. So do you think that can be something that's like pretty easily achieved? Because it seems like there's a lot of gray area in that. What do you think, Synergistic?
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of struggle with that because it's so subjective, man. Like, even like thinking about it when you were talking about it, I'm just like, well, I can find a scenario where, like, you know, I would add a couple cards here and there, especially just stacks, right? Just to use stacks as an example. Sorry for the stutter. Stack strategies tend to be looked up as stronger, even though, you know, they can be playing on pace, just because they stop people from doing or playing the game. Right. So, for example, a Grand Arbiter can be considered a really strong card because it's making everybody, you know, having to pay 1 more for their spells, and making you in return also pay 2 less potentially for casting your spells. So it makes it very difficult. I was going to point out, like, potentially the solution is, like, you know, having like efficiency out of the 100, and then how fast you can win the game, like being like 2 different scales, and then like having like a weighted average of them. But that it's too much work, and then B, stacks just breaks that, because like I said, stacks isn't about winning quick. It's about making your opponents kind of suffer and take a long time to win the game. So that kind of throws out a little formula of like how efficient your deck is and how fast you can win as well. Because if you're winning quickly, your deck's pretty efficient, right? That's essentially what that means. If you're winning turn 0, 1, 2, or 3, your deck's pretty fast and it works well together often. So that obviously doesn't really apply when you're playing stacks, because stacks decks can often take longer to play. So
would you say that stacks decks are kind of like the exception to the rule, whereas they break the format in terms of what they're doing is changing how the game plays?
Yeah, because you're requiring people to use their mana in different ways that they otherwise wouldn't. Like,
or even just restricting certain things, like not being able to draw more than 1 card each turn, not being able to play more than 1 spell each turn, which some decks are crucial at. So
not letting your creatures attack.
Yeah, even at the lower power levels, like things like Propaganda, which we don't see often in stacks decks at higher power levels, and we're talking things that are like stacks is a really powerful strategy, but even at the lower power levels, like Propaganda is the poster child probably for that.
So here's kind of my solution. Take stacks out of the equation, but, you know, look at your list of 100 cards. How are there any pet cards? Are all 100 cards efficient, right? And then how often do you win the game? How quickly can your strategy win? And have like a weighted average or something, and that can be like a good way to like point it out, right? If you have 70 cards that are very efficient, but you often win in turn 1 or turn 2, like, you know, that's going to be better than having 100 cards that are efficient, but you are winning in turn like 10 or 11, right? So I don't know, having like a combination or a mixture of both of them, I think it's a good way to look at it, instead of, you know, assuming, instead of having them like side by side, because that doesn't really mean anything from my perspective, as shown on the power levels in EDH kind of chart.
So if we took, say, let's kind of break it down like this. If we took a precon, okay.
Sure.
There is a way to take the precon, trim the fat, change the cards, and take it from level 3 to a level 10, right? And that is by essentially picking a game plan, which then that already upgrades it, right? Because a precon is kind of like in between multiple game plans. That's where precons struggle, is that they don't really hone in on one thing. And then you make it more efficient, adding fetches, adding tutors, adding ramp, like your mana rocks and things like that to make it more efficient. That already bumps it up to now a 7 or 8, because now you are able to not only have a solid game plan, but now you also have the ability to get to that game plan faster. So what, in your opinion, really changes having a solid game plan that you're getting too fast to a, competitive 9 or 10 where you are looking at these turn 1s or turn 2 wins? Could it like, where do you guys like see those categories really falling into?
I think it goes back to kind of what we were talking about with stacks, is we are restricting the gameplay and you're changing the way that it's played. In a sense, if you're winning too quick, you're changing the way the game is played because the game can't be played anymore. And if this strategy, say you just want to set up like an engine, because a lot of times people just have, pet strategies in a sense. Like, I think we're talking about pet cards, but a lot of people have entire decks dedicated around one central thing, and things like Mana Crypt, Demonic Tutor. Make sure that even if this thing isn't, even if this, this plan, this strategy isn't going to end the game or win the game or stop anyone from being able to do what they want to do, if they're using cards like Mana Crypt and Demonic Tutor to get the cards they need because it's so inefficient, then I think that could be something where it turns into a little gray area. Because if the strategy is so bad, but you're using things like Mana Crypt and Demonic Tutor to prop it up at an appropriate power level, then I think that's where those could be considered to not immediately put you into the 7 or 8, because there are some decks that just really just want to run a really inefficient strategy, but they need those cards to do it regularly because it's so random. The amount of games you need to play, you're never going to get it off.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with Reptile. I think it's pretty sort of gray-ish, like you mentioned. And I honestly, I think the solution to this is kind of like the rule zero conversations we have, because having that conversation beforehand, like, this is kind of the game I'm expecting. I'm expecting this game to last 10 turns. I'm expecting to do X, Y, and Z. I don't want my lands to be destructed. I want to be able to cast my spells. That kind of helps with this, but it's very difficult to sit down and being like, are we playing 7s? Everybody playing 7s? Because that could honestly mean so many different things to many different people, like we've mentioned. Right. So
okay, that's very fair. So we've kind of talked about the different levels kind of building up to these big 2, 9, and 10 cedh, but there's something that we really haven't touched on. We've kind of covered it in terms of, like you just said it, with the expectation for the game, but like there's a turn count scale on here that kind of puts where you're pressuring the win is equal to where you are on this tier list. And I feel like that in this specific tier list, and when like measuring Magic the Gathering decks, period, is not a fair way to measure tier lists, right? Because, like, let's say, for example, a Kinnan deck, very common in our group. We play against it a lot. We see it a lot. We know it wins very fast. It could be a turn 2 win commonly. So you have to keep interaction, okay? But you set that in a pod with like a Nagila deck or a Timna Chrom deck or things like that that are also cedh decks, but they're not necessarily winning turn 2, turn 3. They're setting up for a turn 4 with having very important interaction. That automatically turns it into a level 9. Like, it takes it from being a competitive 10 to a 9 just because it is set up to have a value engine to then get to the game and have interaction in between. Right.
Agreed.
So I feel like it's very inefficient when you speak of cedh decks. Having an actual tier for them makes it inefficient because there are playstyles that just don't win in 2 turns, but are just as likely to win as any other type of deck, right?
Yeah, I think a great example of that is Winota. It's one of the strongest decks. Like, cedh is just an overall, representation of EDH in general, just with the strongest cards. And it's represented. It often doesn't. It almost never wins on turn 3 unless it can get its Kiki Jiki combo going. But
Right.
that's if we're going by the turn count. That deck is meant to pressure and slow down the game and win in turn 9, turn 10 through
Mhm.
pressure, but stopping your opponents along the way. And that would be considered a. Let me take a look. Turn 10. So Winota would be a 6. It'd be a deck with a
Right.
plan, which is.
And like Winota's strong. Winota can like really pressure life totals and things like that where people don't like really do that because they're combo decks. They win through a, Thassa, kind of combo line or things like that. And so like another great one to like mention is Yuriko. Like Yuriko is not winning turn 2 unless you're Thassa consulting. Like you are pressuring life totals by ninjutsuing, getting your creatures out and going in, and then having interaction to stop other players. So like I don't know if turn count should even really be considered, except for to say how fast you can win. Like I don't think that should determine where you fall on the list. What's your thoughts on this synergistic?
Yeah, no, I essentially agree. Except, I do think it's important because again, we can have 100 good cards, right? You can have all the forces, you can have all the free spells, but all your creatures are literally like bad humans that are vanilla,
Mhm.
right? But I guess
Right.
so. But I guess that counts into like the cards not being good or the deck not synergizing well. I think it has to be like a mixture because I think deck turns are important to an extent because that's what makes cedh games will take 30 minutes or 20 minutes to play, right? Sometimes more often than not because they will be finished so quickly. But there are strategies out there that like we know that like Reptile mentioned that will make it take longer. So I kind of struggle with that. I was like I mentioned I was thinking of like the weighted like efficiency versus like turn order or turn count to have like some sort of like weighted value to them. And obviously in cedh none of this matters because you're playing cedh. So I don't know if this should apply to cedh. It should be like its own little thing because in cedh, like we've talked about, you only care about winning. So who cares what your deck is, what anyone else thinks about it, as long as you feel comfortable with it and you can win with it versus other strong decks. So those are just kind of my 2 cents on that.
Okay, so what you're kind of saying is that when sitting down to play EDH, okay, just regular old plain old Commander, the only things that on this list that really matter are levels 3 through 8. A normal precon to almost being a cedh deck, but having pet cards and things like that. When you decide to take a deck and make it competitive, it no longer falls on a list that would be comparable, right? Because game strategies change, game plans change. Certain cards that would be considered too slow or not great in EDH now become staples in cEDH because they change the way the game plays, right? Is that kind of along the lines of what you guys are saying?
I think so, yeah. And it really, with what you were saying about the how it would change the power level, and like I think high power is a term that I've heard thrown around, and it's almost the limbo. It's almost like when you're crossing into cEDH, and it's for you have strong efficient strategies, but up against the best decks, it really can't compete. I mean,
Right.
I think I even have one as one of my pet decks is Azuri Claw Progress. Like it, if I were to go up against it has a way to combo, it has ways to go through it, but it is not as efficient, and it really can't compete too well against the top level decks. So it sits in this limbo of being too weak for cEDH, but too strong for most of the other levels. And I think a lot of decks kind of get put in there when people are trying to upgrade, especially when they're pet commanders that aren't really that good, but you're putting things in there like Mana Crypt and all the fast mana and all the tutors.
Okay. So, kind of like wrapping up, the overall concept is that as good intentions as this list is, it just does not cover the format well enough for it to be used properly. And that's why there's so much confusion about power levels in this format. because there's part of this format that falls way outside of what power levels can be considered, and then there's the general part of the format that's like precons being considered one of the lowest ends of where the power is. Anything that's lower powered than that really should just be considered a precon level. Like I don't think that there's a necessity to like understand what a 1 means in that context. If it's considered to be able to play toe to toe with a precon, then it should be considered a precon, or at least a precon level. And then everything that falls above an 8, like into cedh levels, it should be on its own list. Like it needs a totally different power level guide. And like the consensus on turn count is it is important for a rule 0 conversation, but it is also unfair to like categorize the power level of a deck because it's not winning on turn 0 or turn 1. Right. It's really putting some niche decks into a field of what's considered a bad deck because it's not winning fast enough. So I think those are like all really good points. And I think going forward, it's good to have like this would be a great conversation to have for your rule 0 conversation. But if I, personally, if I were to change the list, I would only have it run 3 through 8. So it would be 6 power levels, 6 being almost CEDH, 1 being a precon. And then from there, it would be defined on if it has a solid game plan, how fast it can get to the game plan, and how well it does that game plan, and how fast that game plan can win, right? And that'll determine where you fall on that scale. Is that kind of the consensus here?
Yeah, I think so. Overall, I think 1 through 3 really doesn't exist because you don't see it or 1 through 2 doesn't really exist. 9 and 10 are usually cedh. The upper echelons and the bottom are defined, and you really just have to rule 0 it out in what the play experience wants. And the levels give you a decent understanding, but they shouldn't be followed strictly because they're subjective. So I think it's a good basis, but overall, yeah, just be upfront with what you're trying to do with your deck, and I think overall,
yeah, I think it's a good way to start the conversation.
Okay, well, thank you guys for sitting down and having this conversation with me today. And thank you for everybody who stuck around and listened to the whole conversation and let us just rip on this list. Nothing against the creator. It's so commonly passed around and so little understood that we felt like it was a genuinely good topic to address. So yeah, don't forget to follow us on our socials and keep up with what we're posting and playing, and all the links for that are in the description below.
Stay basic.
Stay basic.